aunt of mine, a sister of my mother's, one time was laughing about a story she was telling. She was telling a story of how she had been 6 or 7 years old, walking home from school, and this flasher, you know, like the guy in a trench coat, naked underneath, a flasher had flashed her rather, you know, exposed himself to her, right? When she was like 6 or 7. And she was a grown woman of, I don't know, 60-something at this time when she was telling the story. And you know how she told this story? She laughed about it. Yeah, she thought it was a hoot. She laughed her head off about it, right? And in point of fact, another one of her friends, I remember quite clearly in a dinner party I was at, you know, another one of her friends who had been the same age, yeah, and she had known that flasher too, and she thought it was funny as hell too. And their approach to this flasher had been how absurd and ridiculous, and they had a laugh about it, and then the conversation rolled on to other things, right? But in our contemporary culture, is that the norm? No, certainly not. Nowadays, everybody would have a complete hissy fit over the fact of being flashed. In point of fact, today it would be fashionable for this aunt of mine, or any woman who's been flashed by some pervert, to go on and on and on about how traumatized they were. Yeah, they'd get brownie points for grinding on the fact that they'd been so traumatized by this flasher. Yeah. Now, the fact is, this aunt and her friend who had both been flashed by this pervert, they were perfectly fine. Okay, they were not traumatized by it at all. Because ultimately, trauma depends, or trauma's impact on you depends on how much importance you decide to give it. The fact of the matter is, at this time, we are living in this crazy-ass age where people get social points for being more traumatized than the next person. And so people go out of their way to say, oh, I was traumatized, oh, it was so horrible, I was me too, me too, me too. You know, all traumatized by things that, you know, are not necessarily pleasant, but they're not the end of the world. You know what I'm saying? I once heard some woman say that there was nothing worse than rape. Now, rape is very traumatic. It's an awful thing. It's a violent crime. It's rape. It's horrible. Yeah, but I can think of a whole number of things that are much, much worse than rape. Murder. Instantly. That's instantly worse than rape. Yeah. Or like some medieval tortures, right? They used to break people on the wheel. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's horrifying, right? Or somebody who was drawn and quartered. Look that up. That's horrifying. Between being raped and being drawn and quartered, I'll take rape any day of the week. No question, yes. But see, the thing is, the reality, nobody wants to know what is the worst thing. What they want is to feel special because of their trauma. They want to talk about their trauma and have people believe that they are special because of this trauma. But the fact of the matter is, dwelling on any trauma only weakens you. It weakens you and makes you less of a man or less of a woman. It owns you. It defines your existence. We've all suffered horrible traumas in our lives. Some people have been raped. That's awful. I'm not saying that it's not. Some people have been, I don't know, shot at. Some people have been falsely accused of things. Other people have been traumatized by whatever. I mean, we can go all day enumerating the things that can traumatize us. But the fact of the matter is that most people have been traumatized, have been severely traumatized by whatever. And was it fair or not, or this or that, doesn't matter. We've all been traumatized. But the fact of the matter is, the more you dwell on your trauma, the more it defines you. And the more you are unable to see your life through any other lens except by way of this traumatic event that you had. In the case of this aunt that I was telling you about at the beginning of this video, right? She was not allowing herself to be defined by this trivial incident of this flasher. Yes, of course it was traumatic. It was, you know, unpleasant and all the rest of it. But she just thought it was like a funny event that had happened to her. She didn't let it shape the arc of her life. And that's the key issue. You see, we are constantly creating narratives about our lives. The left that constantly talks about narratives, they're right on this. We create narratives of our lives. Because all of the incidents that are going on in our lives, there are so many, right, that we pick and choose, and from these things that stick more in our heads, right, we create a narrative. We create a story about who we are. And each of us has his or her own story. But if you dwell on a trauma and allow that trauma to define your life, right, you can only see the rest of your experiences through the lens of that trauma. You cannot leave that trauma behind. You are always living that trauma every single day. And the fact of the matter is, by the leftists' own words, by these peddlers of this trauma nonsense, of this, this constant victimhood crap, by their very own words of narratives that we create, if you allow a trauma, howsoever severe, to be a central point of the story of your life, then it will define you forever, and you will never be able to get out from under its shadow. It will always own you, and you will always be a victim. You will always be a victim, and therefore you will always be passive. You will be passive in the face of the events that happen to you in your life, and you will be passive in the direction of your life. You will have no control and no agency, because you will forever be a victim if you dwell on your trauma. Now, am I saying that you should deny your trauma? No, certainly not. You should not deny anything that has happened in your life or pretend that it wasn't there. No, that's silly. Yeah? You should look things in the face. But the point I'm trying to make is that, see, you should not allow any trauma, no matter how severe, to be one of the plot points in the novel of your life. It's just a random event that happened, and that's an unfortunate event, but you cannot allow it to define you. And let me explain what would happen if you did allow it to define you. Suppose in the case of the aunt of mine, right? She got flashed by a pervert back when she was 6 years old, and she's a 60-odd-year-old woman, right? Suppose, rather than her relegating it correctly as a minor, trivial incident that happened when she was a child, suppose that she had allowed this incident to define her relationship with all men. And she had said that, this flasher, this random pervert, was the stereotypical male who wanted to force his sexuality on her. Imagine if she had looked at all of her life like that. Then what would have happened? She would have taken every encounter with a man that was not hyper-positive, that was not perfect, that was not perfection itself. She would take every such encounter as more fuel to the fire. She had this preconceived notion, this plot point, that this flasher was a typical male, and every other unpleasant event that she had with a man, she'd add to that narrative. That would be the arc of her story. That would be the plot points of her novel. And so what would have happened? When she hit ages of, I forget when she met her husband, who's still her husband, 25, 24, something like that. When she met her husband, she would have been happy to meet him, happy to meet a potential mate? No, she would have looked at him suspiciously, because she would have been adding to these trauma points, more plot points of this story that all men are evil. Because that first story, that first guy who flashed her, would have been the first plot point of this story arc, right? And so the next one would have been the boyfriend who dumped her, and the next one would have been the old man who leered at her, right? And so finally she meets her, who she does not know yet, of course, the man who could be her husband, right? And what does she do? She rejects him, because the arc of her life is already defining her as rejecting all men, because they're all evil, because that first flasher, that first pervert, when she was 6 years old, set her on this path of hating all men, because she allowed that trauma to define her. And so what would have happened when she met the man who could have been her husband? Well, in this alternate timeline that I'm explaining, right, she wouldn't have gotten with him, because she would have been afraid, or maybe he did something wrong at some point, which is perfectly natural, because at the start of every relationship, people make mistakes and have fights and this and that and break up, and maybe because of that and because of the other plot points that she had made, she wouldn't have continued to see this man who could have been her husband and she wouldn't have had the children and the family and the happiness that she eventually did have. You see? All because she allowed this initial trauma, trivial and insignificant and accidental, to define her. And she kept on dwelling on this trauma, living in its grip, and not allowing herself to chart her own story, but rather being forced to go through a story defined by an accident. In other words, she would have been passive. And that's the thing I hate about all this victimhood crap, that it obliges people to be passive, to not define their own lives. And it gives undue weight to some traumatic event. To some traumatic event that might not have been even that traumatic. I mean, the case of my aunt who got flashed by that pervert back when she was 6 years old, she wasn't traumatized by it. She thought it was funny. You know? And she was healthy enough and self-conscious enough, even as a 6-year-old, to realize that it was just weird and bizarre and had nothing to do with anything. It was just this random accident, like a meteor shower or something, you know? As a child, she was healthy enough, psychologically healthy enough, to know that it was just nothing. As a grown woman, she thought it was funny, which is, of course, the healthy way to approach such an incident. Now, of course, is every trauma laughable? Of course not. There are some traumas, some incidents, some terrible events that happen in our lives that are just earth-shattering and change our lives forever. But it's us who decide whether we are going to have this traumatic event change our lives forever. It's not the event itself. If I were to get raped right now, it would be certainly unpleasant, yeah. That would be, yeah, very unpleasant actually. But if I were to get raped right now, imagine somebody sneaks up behind me, and I'm asking you, please, if you see somebody sneaking up behind me to rape me, please warn me. Put it in the comments, please. If somebody were to sneak up and rape me right now, right, would it be traumatic? Definitely. It would be very traumatic. Would it define my life? No, of course not. It wouldn't define my life at all. It would be this horrible thing that had happened to me while I was recording a video one day, right? But it wouldn't define me at all. In the story of my life, in the novel of my life, you know, it would be some random incident, yeah? If the novel of my life were to be reviewed, you know, the reviewer would say, yeah, it was going great, but then there was this weird rape scene that I couldn't make heads or tails of it, and it really was just, it was gratuitous, but then it continued sailing along. That's what the reviewer would say. Because your life cannot be defined by every single traumatic event. It can be affected by a traumatic event, certainly. I mean, for instance, if you were to be hit by a bus, right, and laid up in the hospital for 6 months, and because of this you lost your job and your career or your business was on hold or what have you, and you know, you had problems with a girlfriend because of this or whatever, yeah, of course, that would be very traumatic. That had affected your life. But I insist, it would not define your life. Getting hit by a bus, if it happens to you, yeah, it's going to be horrible. You're going to be laid up in the hospital for 4 months. But let me ask you, you're laid up in the hospital for 4 months. 5 years later, what are you going to think about that truck hitting you? How are you going to think of it? How are you going to process it? You're going to say to yourself, oh, it's this horrible thing that happened to me. But, you know, I kept on sailing on, sailing on. After I recuperated, I went back to the job, you know, and, you know, our wedding got postponed because of the accident, but we got married. Now we have a couple kids, and, you know, it was just sort of like a parenthesis in my life. It sucked, but, you know, oh well. That's how you would look at getting hit by a truck. And getting hit by a truck, frankly, is a hell of a lot more traumatic than getting raped. But the problem is, of course, that, see, being raped, being sexually assaulted, all this Me Too nonsense, right? To put it quite bluntly, it scores you social points. Yeah, you get raped. I mean, if you're a woman and you claim that you got raped, all of a sudden everybody pays attention to you. All of a sudden everybody is all ears and all of their eyes are locked on you, and they're like, "Poor you! You're such a victim." Oh, ho, ho, ho. So there are incentives, of course, for people to drum up the fact that they were traumatized, they were raped or sexually assaulted or whatever. And of course there's incentive, obviously, for people to lie and to claim that this happened to them. Look at Elizabeth Warren, for crying out loud. She's going up and down claiming that some old professor of hers who suffered from polio, for crying out loud, sexually assaulted her. And it's people who knew the man, knew the situation at the time, say that it's kind of physically impossible because the guy was kind of crippled because of his polio. And he couldn't have been chasing her around to sexually assault her. And that's all bullshit. But of course she's telling that story because right now we're living at a time where people get brownie points for their trauma. And it's incredibly unhealthy. You know, it's really despicable for a politician aspiring to, the major political office to be lying like that. But more importantly, it's horrible for the culture at large and for individuals at large to dwell on trauma. Trauma happens to all of us, but if you dwell on it, it will define you. And ultimately, if you dwell on something that happened to you, like getting hit by a truck, like getting struck by lightning, by being raped by some stranger, they're all the same. They are all random events, certainly unpleasant, horrible in some cases, right? But they are accidents in your life. If you allow those traumas to define you, then you relegate yourself to a passive position in your own life. And you feel that all the misfortune that happens to you is because of this trauma, and that you can never get out of this hole, that you are forever in a hole of victimhood. And it's a bad thing. You've been traumatized by something, whatsoever it may be. You've been traumatized by something that was very unfair or very wrong or very evil, whatsoever it may be, no matter how evil it was, no matter how awful it was. You have a very simple decision. You can either allow that horrible event to define you and be the lenses that you wear whenever you look at anything. Everything in your life viewed through the lens of this awful trauma. Or you can do the sensible thing and realize that this traumatic event, whatsoever it may be, no matter how horrible it was an unlucky break, no different than being hit by a bus. And you say to yourself, it happened, but I moved on and I left it behind and I define my life. That's what you want to do. You want to define your life. You don't want an accident to dictate who you are.